Okay, so anyone listening to this deep dive is probably already somewhat familiar with philosophy and maybe even epistemology specifically. So let's not waste any time with the basics.
Yeah, for sure. So we're going to jump right into the good stuff.
Right into Chinese epistemology based on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on the topic.
And I think it's fair to say that someone coming at this from a Western philosophical perspective is going to find some pretty fundamental differences right off the bat.
Totally. So that's really our mission here, to pull out the most intriguing and insightful aspects of Chinese epistemology that we think a philosopher, someone like you listening, would find most interesting and maybe even challenging.
Yeah, like kind of a mind-expanding experience.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah. And the entry points to this crucial difference right away, saying that while Western epistemology often builds on this idea of justified true belief based on observation, reasoning, and a seemingly separate objective world,
right,
Chinese philosophy starts with a completely different assumption: ontological holism.
Okay, so how does this holistic view change our understanding of knowing? That's a great place to start.
Yeah. So it implies that the world isn't like a bunch of separate things just hanging out there, but more like a huge interconnected web where the connections between things actually make up reality itself.
Right.
The Tao.
Gotcha. So knowing, in this sense, becomes less about, some detached observer grasping a separate fact about the world,
Right.
but more about skillfully navigating that whole complex web of internal relations, kind of like being guided by the experience and insight of those who really get the patterns of the Tao, right? Those who walk the path, so to speak.
I like that, yeah. Less about these abstract universal principles you discover through pure reason, more about understanding in context based on experience and mentorship within this interconnected reality.
Exactly.
That's huge for a philosopher, right?
Oh, absolutely. And this idea of interconnectedness also goes to the very heart of how the self and the act of knowing are understood, which brings us to some of those basic categories of Chinese thought.
All right, let's get into it. Starting with the heart mind, or Ixin.
Okay.
For Western philosophers who are used to thinking about mind and emotions as separate things, how does this integrated Kixin challenge our assumptions?
Well, Ixin literally translates to heart, but it's really understood as heart-mind, a single center that integrates emotions, perception, even rational thought all together.
So no separation.
Nope. And this is a big departure from Western traditions, as Sloat and Fraser's work pointed out.
That is a big difference. So how does that change how we see rationality and justification? If our thinking is inherently tied to feelings and emotions, can we ever really have purely dispassionate reason?
That's a really interesting question, one that Chinese philosophers definitely wrestled with. But even within this holistic view, there's this acknowledgement that we need to actively cultivate our Ixin to really know.
Oh, so there's room for individual agency.
Oh, absolutely. And that's where Yunzi comes in. He placed a lot of emphasis on the role of individual effort in shaping the sin for effective knowing, even within this larger holistic framework. And that leads us to another really important concept. Tianren.
Okay, the unity of humanity and nature. What's the epistemological significance of that for a philosopher thinking about our place in the cosmos?
Well, Tianren says that our self-awareness and the way we understand the world comes from realizing that we're a part of this larger cosmic and social order. Our individual being isn't separate from that. Knowing yourself means understanding how you fit into that interconnected whole.
I see. So it's less about us imposing our mental categories onto a separate world and more about attuning ourselves to the patterns of reality, finding our place within it.
Exactly. A very different approach. And it's interesting to note that even the Analects, which are often known for their ethical teachings, have this implicit idea of virtue epistemology, as pointed out by Mai.
So for philosophers who are interested in the connection between ethics and knowledge, what would they find most insightful in the Analects?
Well, in addition to all the ethical stuff, the Analects kind of suggest that virtue and character aren't just good in themselves, but are actually crucial for true understanding.
Okay.
So it's like the kind of person you are, the virtues you cultivate, directly affects your ability to really know.
I see.
It's not just about being smart, but about your ethical orientation as a knower.
That adds a whole other dimension to the idea of knowing.
Yeah.
And it's related to this idea of practical knowledge, right? Knowing how and knowing to.
Absolutely. And especially that knowing to part the ability to act ethically. That's philosophically rich, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. Where does that capacity for ethical action come from?
Well, there's a bit of debate about that. You have Mengzi and Wang Yangming, who saw it as a kind of intuitive moral knowledge, something already present within us.
Okay.
While Confucius and Xunzi thought it came from learning, rituals, internalizing social norms, things like that.
So we have this classic philosophical question here. Is morality innate or learned? Or some combination of both?
Exactly. And this debate plays out within Chinese philosophy in really interesting ways. And all of this emphasis on practice is also connected to the idea of fancy, Confucian reflective knowledge,
Which is being called extended knowledge.
Hmm.
What's the significance of that, especially for a philosopher thinking about where the mind ends and the world begins?
Well, fancy relies on external structures like texts, rituals, social interactions, even as crucial components for developing understanding.
Yeah.
So basically, these external resources aren't just passive guides, but they actively shape our cognitive processes. And both Mengzi and Ryan and Hutton have argued that this resonates with the extended mind thesis in Western philosophy,
Okay.
which says that our cognitive abilities can extend beyond our brains and bodies into the environment.
So these texts, rituals, they become part of the mind itself in a way.
Exactly. And it's not just abstract knowledge either. Remember, Mengzi considered the heart-mind a sense organ. How does that fit into his overall view of knowing?
Yeah, a sense organ. That's pretty wild. How can something that does thinking and feeling also be a sense organ?
Well, he saw the sins as the primary interpreter of sensory information.
Okay,
So all those sights, sounds, smells, they're all processed through the sin.
I see.
And Yao points out that for Mengzi, knowing was more than just thinking. It involved cultivating that original mind to understand ourselves, connect with heaven, and become fully realized humans.
And knowing wasn't just this abstract concept, was it? Bryce and Zhu point out that Z is often used in the context of knowing X, specifically knowing virtue.
Right. It's about understanding and embodying those virtues, not just knowing about them intellectually. But even that view of the mind might seem limited. The Guanzi actually takes an even broader approach, including other organs as part of the mind, and legalist thought, as Yinyi pointed out, further developed the role of senses like seeing and hearing in gaining knowledge.
Okay, so knowledge really is an embodied experience.
Yeah.
Which leads to Tyerman or Tyan bodily recognition.
Yeah.
What's the significance of this for a philosopher who's into embodied cognition?
Well, Tyron highlights that perception happens through the body. We don't just think about our experiences, we feel them, sense them. It challenges the idea of a mind that's totally detached from the body, as Ni argues.
Okay.
This contrasts a bit with the Mohists, who differentiated between a thing and its unfolding,
Right.
which suggests a slightly less embodied and more analytical approach in their school of thought.
So in this early period, the dominant view really emphasizes this integrated, embodied way of knowing. As Yang says, there's no hard line between subject and object. It was really only with the rise of Neo-Confucianism that this started to change. Now on to language. Ming and Shi, names and actualities. What a perfect topic for philosophical discussion.
It is, right. And the source makes this point about harmonic regularity being a fundamental condition for us to comprehend anything.
Okay.
And this is tied to language. The idea is that for reality to be stable and understandable, our language has to accurately reflect that inherent order. Language becomes the framework for social understanding. And standardizing it was super important to ensure it aligned with those structural regularities of existence.
Which leads us to a very fundamental philosophical problem.
Mm-hmm.
The relationship between the concepts we have, thing, and the actual realities they're supposed to represent.
Yeah. And then there's the Confucian theory of correct names. That's a big one.
Right. So for a philosopher thinking about ideal states or the power of language in creating social order, what's at the heart of this idea of correct names?
The Confucians, particularly as described in the Analects and by Rücker,
Right.
believed that there was this past golden age where words perfectly matched social roles and everyone acted in accordance with the true meanings of their positions
Right.
and the chaos of the warring states period. They saw that as coming from a disconnect between those names and how people were behaving.
Interesting.
So to get back to that harmony, they thought we had to fix language, get those names right again.
So it's a view where words have this inherent power, this ability to reflect an ideal social and cosmic order.
Exactly. And then you have Xunzi, who builds upon this idea.
What was his philosophical contribution to the correct names theory?
He kind of split it into two aspects.
Okay.
The conceptual aspect, which stressed the need for everyone to agree on shared distinctions, and the pragmatic aspect, which focused on fixing language problems because they saw those as symptoms of deeper intellectual and moral errors.
So language wasn't just about describing things. It was about actively shaping understanding and social reality.
Exactly. But then you have the Mohists. They were a bit skeptical of this whole correct names idea.
Oh, yeah. Why is that?
Well, Mote argued that language shouldn't be bound to some idealized past.
Okay.
It should change with the times, adapting to current social needs and practicality.
That sounds a lot more flexible, more grounded in the realities of life.
It is less about a perfect unchanging system, more about how language can serve human purposes effectively.
So we have this philosophical tug-of-war between a language based on an ideal order and a language shaped by what we actually need to function.
Right. Which brings us back to that core epistemological question.
Yeah.
How do Xi and Ming relate?
Exactly. How do we make sure our names actually match up with reality? And remember how the source mentioned this binary valuation, Xi-Fei, true and false. The idea was to use names according to the principles of reality. And then we get to the school of names, the Mingjia, and their fascinating, almost proto-logical way of thinking.
Right.
What would a philosopher, especially one interested in meaning, reference, and the history of logic, find most significant about their approach?
Well, Gongsun Long and the Mingjia believed that having a well-defined and precise language was crucial. They saw a strong connection between language and the way society works.
Okay.
And they tried to get rid of what they saw as problematic overlap in meaning.
Okay.
Holding on to this Confucian ideal that names and the things they refer to should perfectly match. You know, Gongsun Long's famous white horse is not a horse paradox.
Yeah.
That's a classic example of how they were grappling with categorization and the subtleties of language.
Those are the kinds of linguistic puzzles that philosophers still love to debate. And the neo-mohists, they had a different take on this whole semantic overlap thing, right?
They did. They saw it as a natural part of language, and they were more interested in figuring out how language works as this tool for categorizing the world around us.
Both the natural and the social world, right?
Exactly. Their goal wasn't to make language perfectly unambiguous, but to analyze the logical structures behind our classifications.
And then later on, we have those neo-Taoist discussions about Yan Yi, the relationship
Yeah.
between language and meaning.
Right.
It sounds like they moved beyond just looking at how words correspond to concrete things, pushing into deeper territory.
They did. During the Wei Jin era, philosophical inquiry started focusing on the structure of meaning itself, not just on how names point to things. Thinkers like those Tang discussed explored how suitable different names were for denoting things. Ming Li Lun.
Okay.
Which eventually led to them realizing that there's such a thing as meta-language, the ability to reflect on and analyze language itself. That was a huge step in understanding what language can and can't do.
And much later, pre-modern thinkers like Dai Zen came along, emphasizing the importance of really understanding concrete facts, Jinqi Shi, through rigorous objective principles.
Yes. That really reflects a recurring theme in Chinese epistemology.
The importance of grounding knowledge in the observable world.
Exactly. So we've talked about the heart, mind, and language. Now let's dive into that final basic category. Knowledge, Shi, and action, Haxing.
Right. This philosophical debate about which one comes first has huge implications for how we understand why we seek knowledge in the first place.
It does. In that classical holistic view, knowing and doing were totally intertwined, like two sides of the same coin. Chang argued that separating knowledge from action alienates us from the world.
Okay.
True understanding means you live it, not just think about it.
So knowing something intellectually isn't enough. It has to be reflected in how you act in the world.
Right. And this idea of the unity of Zi and Xing became a core part of Neo-Confucianism, especially with Wang Yangming.
And he really pushed that connection, didn't he?
Oh, yeah. He believed that genuine knowledge, Zhenzi, always leads to action.
Okay.
It's connected to his concept of liangzi, that innate moral knowledge that guides us toward what's right.
So for Wang Yangming, knowing and doing were basically inseparable.
Exactly. Liangzi is that inner moral compass, and Zhenzi is the kind of knowing that always results in ethical behavior. But not everyone agreed. In the 17th century, you had thinkers like Wang Fuzi who thought action should come before knowledge.
What was the thinking behind that shift?
Some felt that the focus on knowledge had become too abstract and intellectual. They wanted to emphasize the importance of actually doing things, of practical engagement as a way to really understand. That was a big part of the school of practical learning.
Shikwi.
Right. They were all about connecting knowledge to concrete, real-world applications.
Exactly. And this emphasis on action even influenced later Chinese thought, like Mao Zedong's On Praxis.
Though Mao was coming at it from a Marxist perspective, right? Where theory and practice are seen as this constantly interacting back and forth.
Exactly. But the influence of that practical, action-oriented approach is definitely there. And this back and forth between knowing and doing is a continuing thread in Chinese thought. Okay, so we've covered the basic categories of Chinese epistemology. Now let's move on to some of its most defining features, starting with its relational nature. Okay, so how does this relational aspect challenge Western epistemology? I mean, Western philosophy often talks about this independent knower observing a separate world.
Right. It's a big difference. Xie goes so far as to call Chinese epistemology fundamentally relational. Instead of separate things, the world is seen as this incredibly complex web, full of interconnections, feedback loops, all governed by underlying structural principles or lie. And this all exists within a larger, organic, cosmic order.
So it's not just stuff happening randomly. There's this underlying pattern to it all.
Exactly. And our minds, they're also structured in accordance with these principles.
Which makes this kind of resonance or compatibility a precondition for perception itself, as Rucker explains. So knowing isn't about passively receiving information from an object out there.
Okay.
It's about this dynamic interplay within a field of relationships.
So knowledge comes from being in tune with those relationships, not from detached observation.
Exactly. Methods like Jiwu and Fangxing then become ways to understand these connections.
Yeah, those are key methods. Jiwu, exploring the patterns of the external world, and Fangxing, introspection, both aim to investigate these dynamic relationships, which, as Zhang points out, can be continuous or discontinuous.
And knowledge itself becomes recognizing those structural principles that govern the Tao.
Right. It's about seeing those patterns and understanding how they work.
I love that metaphor of the Tao as a path or a way.
Yeah.
With smooth paths representing wisdom and blocked paths representing ignorance. It perfectly illustrates how understanding flows through those relationships, as Morrow pointed out.
It does, and this relational aspect is tightly linked to Tian'er'ei, the unity of humanity and nature,
right,
and to the debates around Ming and Xi and Zi and Xing et al., underscores this fundamental interconnectedness.
And it's interesting how later on, Buddhism, which came from outside of China, introduced the subject-object distinction, Neng and Suo,
right,
which, while different, actually ended up helping the Chinese understand Western philosophical ideas when those were eventually introduced.
Yeah, it's like it provided a bridge between those two different ways of thinking.
Another really defining feature of Chinese epistemology is what the entry calls the axiology of comprehension. Basically, the idea that values, especially moral values, are inherently part of knowing.
Yeah, and this is a major contrast with Western epistemology, which often tries to separate facts from values.
Exactly. So how does Chinese philosophy see that connection between morality and knowledge?
Well, Paul and other scholars argue that classical Chinese thought treats epistemology as part of virtue ethics. The virtues we cultivate are seen as operating within that larger context of the Tao.
So it's not just about being a good person, it's about being a good person in order to know.
Right. They often reject the idea of purely factual knowledge divorced from ethical considerations.
So ethical cultivation becomes essential for certain types of knowledge.
Exactly. They really believe in this deep connection between goodness and truth, between virtue and reason.
Okay.
And it's not just ethics. Even traditional Chinese aesthetics, as Chen and Zhao argue, embodies principles of knowledge that are tied to moral cultivation.
Interesting. So beauty and morality are somehow intertwined.
In a way, yes. Confucian epistemology particularly emphasizes this need for moral cultivation.
Okay.
And they see this as key for truly knowing. You know that famous saying of Confucius, genuine knowledge stems from humaneness, Irvin.
Yeah.
That really encapsulates this idea.
And the teachings about self-cultivation really focus on developing those right attitudes and feelings as being essential for true knowing.
Right. And then you have Mengzi's concept of the moral self, Benson within our original heart-mind.
Which modern Confucians like Hu Fuguan and Li Mingwei have interpreted as this innate moral foundation that's key for understanding.
Exactly. And it's fascinating how even things like subjectivity and bodily desires, as Yu argues, get incorporated into moral responsibility and actually become part of rationality.
So everything is connected.
Right. And this all culminates in Wang Yangming's concept of Liangji, innate moral knowledge.
Which is a key idea for philosophers thinking about moral intuition. Right.
Absolutely. It's worth mentioning, though, that some within the tradition have critiqued this heavy focus on morality.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Muzong-san, for instance, argued that it actually held back the development of science and democracy in China.
Interesting.
He even proposed a temporary negation of the moral self. And Shamshili, although from a different perspective, also offered a similar critique, saying we need to balance this inward focus on the inner sage with a more outward-facing approach of the outer ruler.
So even with this strong emphasis on the moral side of knowing, there's been internal debate about its potential downsides.
Exactly. Now, this brings us to what might be the most intriguing concept for a philosopher. Onto epistemology.
Okay, the idea that being and knowing are inseparably linked. What's the core of this concept for someone grappling with fundamental questions about existence and consciousness?
In the holistic view, what we know is, in a sense, part of knowledge itself.
Okay.
Existence and understanding are deeply intertwined. It's this relationship of mutual dependence, but not in a solipsistic way. Perception and interpretation are seen as part of our individual being, which Chang has explored in what he calls ontohermeneutics.
So it's like the world shapes how we know, and how we know shapes the world.
Yes, we can't have this completely neutral, objective stance.
Sure.
And this unity of being and knowing is present in classical texts, even though they express it in different ways.
Right.
Think of Junzi and Zhuangzi, for example. However, later on, especially with realist Neo-Confucianism and some more recent developments, this subject-object dualism started creeping in, influenced partly by Western philosophy. And in modern Chinese philosophy, there's this ongoing debate about whether ontology or epistemology comes first, with some trying to revive that classical unity view.
Let's shift gears and look at some of those classical approaches to epistemology in Chinese thought. The pre-Han debates about language, thought, and reality were pretty foundational, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely foundational. And that conflict between the Confucian traditionalist view of language and the Mohist utilitarian view really set the stage for so much that came later.
Yeah, Hansen really highlights this early tension between the Confucian belief that names embody the essence of things versus the Mohist view that understanding is relative and we can't be sure about shared meaning.
Exactly. And then you have these uniformist reactions to that tension, like Xunzi's relativistic approach that still advocated for the Confucian way of standardizing language for social order, which Fraser has analyzed in detail. For Xunzi, while acknowledging that language is based on convention, Confucian norms offered the best way to achieve social harmony. MacLeod also points out that Xunzi believed correct names were established by the sage who understood those underlying lie.
So we still have this idea of an ideal language, even if it's acknowledged to be somewhat relative.
Exactly. And later, Han Fei built on this, combining traditionalist and utilitarian ideas and arguing that language could be a tool for political control.
Wow. Okay.
Even Wang Chong during the Han Dynasty expanded the idea of Xin, saying it includes different kinds of truth, not just factual truth, linguistic truth, behavioral truth, personal truth, and so on.
That's really interesting. We have those approaches that move away from understanding knowledge solely through language, like with Laozi and Mengzi.
Right. They kind of sought knowledge beyond words. So Laozi, as described in the entry, was all about going beyond language to achieve a more direct understanding of the natural order through introspection without relying on words.
Okay.
And Mengzi, with his belief in innate goodness, Saxing, developed a Confucian epistemology that in some interpretations downplayed the role of language in ethical action, as Hansen argues.
Interesting.
So for them, true understanding wasn't about following linguistic rules or definitions. It came from a deeper internal source.
So we're moving away from a strictly language-based understanding of knowledge.
Exactly. Now let's talk about those proto-analytic approaches like the school of names and the neo-mohists. For a philosopher who's into logic, language, and the history of those fields, what's most significant about those schools of thought?
Okay, so with the school of names and the neo-mohists, we see this early engagement with logic and linguistic analysis, right?
Exactly. They were grappling with some pretty fundamental questions about meaning and the connection between language and reality.
So Gongsun Long and the School of Names, as Shang explained, believed in having a super precise language.
Right.
They thought it was absolutely crucial for a well-functioning society.
And they tried to eliminate any ambiguity in meaning. You know, that famous white horse is not a horse argument? That perfectly shows their approach. They were trying to get at the essence of categorization to really understand how we use language to define things.
And the neo-mohists, they had a different take, right?
They did. While they were also interested in language, they were more pragmatic. They focused on how we actually use language to make sense of the world, even with all its ambiguities.
So one school was searching for this ideal of perfect linguistic proficiency, while the other was analyzing how language actually functions.
Exactly. And then you have Shi with his relativism and paradoxes,
Yeah.
challenging those neo-Mohist realists.
Right. His paradoxes, described in the Zhuangzi, really push the boundaries of what we think we know. They expose potential problems and contradictions in those seemingly straightforward definitions.
Exactly. And his work highlighted this idea that there's a kind of relativity to all understanding, which is why the rediscovery of those proto-analytic thinkers in the 20th century was so important. It showed how diverse and sophisticated early Chinese philosophy really was.
Even the neo-Mohists themselves recognize that language can be unreliable, that it's hard to make it perfectly consistent. They focused on causal connections instead of trying to create this ideal language. And their analysis of tongyi, identity and difference, as being tied to context, was pretty insightful.
Yes, they were really digging into the complexities of language. And then we have Shi, who used paradoxes to challenge that whole idea of using tongyi to come up with universal standards for names, him, Ming.
Right.
He believed that any two things could be seen as both different and identical depending on how you look at them. His relativism was a direct response to those neo-Mohist realists.
Okay, so then we have egalitarian epistemology, which was heavily influenced by Zhuangzi.
Yeah.
It's quite a departure from those more hierarchical views of knowledge we've talked about.
It is. Zhuangzi built on Shi's relativism, saying that knowledge is infinite, but we as humans have limited capacity for it.
Right.
Which means that everything we understand is, in a way, relative, as the source explains. Truth, then, becomes about shared values. Each person's subjectivity determines what they consider knowledge. Objective truth, in the traditional sense, is basically an illusion.
So in that sense, everyone's understanding is equally valid, right?
Yes. From that radical perspective, yes. Zhuangzi saw reality as this ultimate nothingness from which we distinguish individual things through our thinking processes, as Feng puts it.
Correct.
He also drew a distinction between the natural world, which we can't really know,
Right.
and the artificial world, the world shaped by human activity, which we can know.
Okay.
Zhuangzi, like Shi, was skeptical of the idea that we can come up with universal standards for meaning using concepts like identity and difference.
Interesting.
Because of that, Zhuangzi believed that the only way to truly understand this ultimate reality is through introspection. And his views on language were super nuanced.
How so?
He recognized the inherent limitations of language, especially when it came to capturing true embodied knowledge, as Lai has discussed. He even advocated for a kind of forgetting of conventional language-based knowledge to reach a more authentic connection with the Tao.
That's a pretty radical idea.
It is, and Zhuangzi didn't really worry about whether people agreed on their understanding of things.
Oh, interesting.
He saw that desire for agreement as stemming from social ambitions. His view was very individualistic, you could even say mystical in some ways.
So this egalitarian epistemology suggests that each person's understanding is valid within their own framework. That takes us to a pretty big turning point in Chinese epistemology, the arrival of Buddhism and the rise of Neo-Confucianism.
Right. That's when Chinese thought encountered this huge external philosophical system, leading to some major changes in how they understood knowledge.
So how did Buddhism, especially Chan Buddhism, impact Chinese epistemology?
Well, after that peak of Chinese Buddhism, epistemology became a central focus for Songming Neo-Confucianism, as Wen points out. That Buddhist subject-object distinction, Neng and Suo, had an early influence on thinkers like Shaoyang. But Chan Buddhism was even more impactful. Its idea of direct, wordless enlightenment really resonated with some Chinese thinkers. This shifted the focus from metaphysical questions to more epistemological ones, how we know the world and achieve wisdom.
Okay.
Detachment, in Chan, was seen as a key virtue for attaining emptiness. And this idea of detachment resonated with the Chinese concept of sin, the heart mind.
Okay.
So Chan Buddhism combined elements of earlier Buddhist epistemology with Chinese ideas, contributing to that blend that became Neo-Confucianism.
Interesting. And this synthesis led to different epistemological viewpoints within Neo-Confucianism, right? From those more subjective, idealistic approaches to more objective, realistic ones.
Exactly. We see this progression from Liao and Zhu Dunya to the Chang brothers, Zhu Ji, and then the idealist schools of Lu Juwan and Wen Yingming.
with Wang Yangming ultimately advocating for this idea of nothing outside the mind.
Right. And even those labeled as realistic Neo-Confucians, like the Cheng brothers and Zhu Xi, stressed this idea of Zai getting it yourself, which Tuol has written about.
So personal experience and understanding were crucial for them too.
Yes. And that distinction between subjective and objective knowledge became even more explicit in 17th century epistemology, showing that Buddhist influence... Early Neo-Confucians like Shaoyang grappled with similar distinctions.
Right. Shaoyang had those dialogues exploring subjective and objective comprehension using the ideas of identity and difference.
Exactly. Zhu Xi then formalized those categories as methodological tools, advocating for an objective approach to knowledge to avoid subjective bias. And even later, Wang Fuzi, while stressing the objective reality of the world, still engaged with that subject-object distinction, talking about it in terms of potentiality, adding, and material basis.
And then there's the concept of Li, which really took on a new life in Neo-Confucianism.
It did. That idea of the structural principle evolved from mainly an ontological idea to a central epistemological one. It became seen as the underlying pattern through which things are understood. Similar to the Tao, but manifesting on both cosmic and everyday levels.
So Li isn't just about the structure of reality, it's how we understand it.
Exactly. Knowledge becomes about grasping and following Li. The Tao is more abstract, apprehended through intuition and reason. But Li provides a more concrete principle for guiding our reason. Shaoyang was already using Li in this new way.